Call up Alan Barclay to start us off then on this session. Alan is going to talk to us about GI labeling and implementation programs in Australia, I expect.
Thanks, Tom. We need my presentation then.
Is that the right one?
No.
No.
This. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me, and of course the sponsors who without me wouldn't be here today. So I really appreciate it. There are my relevant conflicts of interest. I guess I mostly deal with food regulations, and I am a consultant, so I do work for a variety of food companies. These are the past 2 years. So, first of all, a brief history. So many of you will be familiar with Professor Jenny Brand-Miller's seminal book, co-authored with Kay Foster-Power, dietitian, and Steve Colliguri, endocrinologist, back in the middle of the 1990s. And this was a bestseller, both down under, but I believe in North America as well. And it inspired a lot of people. So it inspired food companies to start putting nutrition content claims, which are things like low fat and high fibre and what have you, on the labels of their foods in the late 1990s after it was published. So there was a strong consumer demand and food industry started putting claims on foods. These weren't specifically regulated under our food standards code or in our code of practice on nutrition content claims at that point in time, but it was permitted because it was basically providing information that was not false or misleading. So just general provisions under consumer law. And in the late 1990s, I started working at Diabetes Australia, which was across the road from the University of Sydney, bumped into Professor Jenny Brand-Miller. Our members were asking for a program to help them choose healthy foods, and Jenny was getting asked to put GI on the labels of the food. So we got together and we started talking about the GI symbol program. Now, at the same time, we were reviewing our food standards code. And in part of that, there was a whole section on nutrition, health and related claims. Up until that point in time, what we call high-level health claims were permitted. So you couldn't say a food was suitable for people with diabetes. So that's when we decided we needed to sort of have a workaround where we could talk about healthy foods for people with diabetes. And that's really how I got involved with the GI symbol program. And as part of my work for Diabetes Australia, I started working for the working group on nutrition, health and related claims down in Canberra, which is our equivalent to your Ottawa in Australia. And we were actively lobbying for GI claims to be officially included in that food standards code. So that process took a number of years. We were talking about it in the late 90s. This is early noughties. And as you'll see later, it didn't really come about until much later from a food standards perspective. But we did start talking to the staff at our food regulator, so Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. We talked about what we wanted to achieve. Basically, we wanted to achieve a reduction in the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. We were looking at the rate, saying it was getting up too high, and we needed to do something to stop it from developing. So we developed an in-house nutrient profiling model. People here are probably familiar with a similar thing. I think it was a heart check that you had in Canada. I don't know if you still have it. We had the Heart Foundation tick in Australia, and they had nutrition guidelines. We used those, but we also built our own around diabetes, obviously around the amount of carbohydrate and the quality of carbohydrate, which the heart tick didn't include at that time. And officially we launched in July 2002 with only one food, but it got a lot of media attention, which was quite important. So all of this was done on the smell of an oily rag, as an old saying. 10,000 Australian dollars was chipped in by the three main organisations, which was the University of Sydney, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation of Australia, and Diabetes Australia. So it wasn't very much money to kick things off. Now, it says the mission was to assist food suppliers in providing and important in consumers in selecting nutritionally healthy foods using the glycemic index. So we weren't just sticking the GI on any kind of food. It had to be an overall healthy food in keeping with good nutritional practices. And we wanted to improve public health by raising the awareness and the understanding of the health benefits of low GI diets from a holistic and chronic disease perspective. So in particular, we wanted to reduce the risk, the rates of diabetes in Australia. And all funds raised in health were invested in health and education and promotion, new research, global collaborations and partnerships. Now, you'll see my last point is that we actually closed the GI Foundation at the end of last year, which many of you perhaps aren't aware. And I'll leave it up to Professor Brand-Miller if she wants to talk a bit later about why, but this is what happened. So the GI Symbol program itself was an endorsement program, and under that piece of food legislation, things like the heart tick and the GI symbol were permitted. This was our original symbol that we launched with back in 2002. Foods had to be tested according to what was then the Australian standard, but later became the international standard. And of course, Professor Brand-Miller spearheaded that, and I had a small part in that as well, which I'm proud to say. We transitioned over to a slightly refined logo a bit later when people pointed out that the previous one perhaps didn't talk about GI enough. So we went over to the slightly modified one. And I have to say, although we intended to have it on low, medium and high GI foods, nobody wanted it on medium or high GI foods. They only wanted low GI foods, which made it quite simple, really. It takes a lot of the complexity out of it. Now, you'll see that there are nutrient guidelines for energy or kilojoules, available carbohydrate, which is standard labelling in Australia and New Zealand, dietary fibre, total and saturated fat and trans fat in some categories, sodium and protein and calcium in certain categories as well. So general good healthy eating principles consistent with dietary guidelines. By the 2020s, there was several hundred foods and beverages in Australia that carried the GI symbol. Here's a small selection of them, so you can see that it's really all the main carbohydrate-containing food categories, including some discretionary but healthier options. Of course, we didn't just stick the label on foods. We did an awful lot of other work, and a lot of it, well, I mentioned it started with the GI Factor book back in 1996, but there were a whole range of books and pamphlets, including by third parties, that not only talked about the GI, but also had the GI symbol on the front. So you can see it there, talking to consumers about the GI symbol. And of course, we were moving into the digital world, so there was a range of websites, Instagram and other things. But most importantly, GI News, which I'm proud to say celebrates its 20th anniversary in July, which is free, and that goes out to about 100,000 subscribers. And of course, in addition to this, there was television works, there was bona fide news, as well as TV advertisements and all sorts of other things as well. So a lot of work went into this, but mostly done, as I said, in a smell of an oily rag, in a NGO basis. So we didn't have a lot of money to do any of this. In addition to that, we developed what were, in fact, the first general level health claims back in 2013. The first one was on physical performance, which was very popular. And the second one was on satiety, or the drive to eat. And these are very popular. And you can see here, I think you can see in the graphics there, some of the claims around sustained energy and keep you fuller for longer, which are actually still with us today. So people were getting immersed in a whole range of discussions about GI. It wasn't just about putting GI on the labels of foods. Now I'm going to switch gears because I've told you that the GI Foundation has closed, but it's not the end of the story, luckily. When we were talking about it with Fazan's way back in the early 2000s, Plan B was put into place, which was to put some provisions within the Food Standards Code that would allow generic low GI claims. And this is part of that standard 1.2.7. It defines glycemic index within it. You'll be familiar with that definition. And it's a special nutrition content claim. It's not a general level health claim. It's a nutrition content claim with some special conditions. And you can see once again, there's provisions for low medium and high GI, but as I said, industry really wasn't interested in that. And it does mention the NPSC, which I'm going to talk about now. That's the nutrient profile scoring criterion. So this was adapted from the UK Food Standards Agency's guidelines for advertising to children. So it was quite a stringent model, and you can see, maybe you can't see, but there are nutrient criteria for all of the key at-risk nutrients, as well as the risk limiting the fruits and vegetables and nuts and legumes and what have you. So it's a reasonably balanced model, and it also happens to underlie our official front of pack labelling system, the Health Star rating system. And a food that gets 3.5 more health stars is considered to be an all-round healthy choice. They're also the foods that are eligible to make low GI claims in Australia and New Zealand. And you can see, and these are fairly recent examples that I got from various companies' websites when I prepared this presentation. There are generic low GI claims on a range of foods and beverages, and there will continue to be so. So we're in the process of updating those general level health claims, for example, for the food companies that want to continue to make low GI claims on the labels of food. So even though the GI Foundation has disappeared, low GI claims continue on foods because consumers want them, and food industry knows that, and therefore they're providing it. And you're probably all thinking, well, what did it all mean? We only have ad hoc nutrition surveys, unfortunately. These are the most recent published ones, though there's been one in 23-24, which we'll be getting results for soon, and we'll be certainly analysing those data when we get them. But these are our most two recent ones. You can see they're very similar in design. The most recent one had a better response rate, but other than that, they're very similar. And we matched the GI and also GL values to those databases that underline them and looked at what was happening in the Australian food supply. In children, you can see that the dietary GI has decreased slightly, but statistically significantly. And more importantly, perhaps the glycemic load has decreased quite a lot. And this was due to a reduction in sugars, which in Australia is primarily sucrose, but also honeys and syrups and sweetened beverages, so sugar-sweetened beverages, juices, and of course, bread rolls, and potatoes. But there were increases in healthy foods like flours and cereals and starches, fruit cereals, fruit nut, and seed bars. Now that's children. In adults, you can see again a greater decrease in the dietary GI and dietary GL. And this was similarly, but slightly different. It was a decrease in breads and rolls, potatoes, added sugars, honeys and syrups, and sweetened beverages again, and an increase in whole grain cereals, cereal-based dishes, and hot cereals. So porridge is very popular in Australia. Plum fruit, apples and pears and what have you, savoury biscuits and grainy crackers, so whole grain crackers. And you can see if we look at it from a glycemic load perspective, and this probably isn't a surprise to people in this room. It is, as we talked about this morning, most people think about sugars as being the main contributor to glycemia in I think, foods in general. But you can see it's actually a lot of the foods we've talked about today, the starchy foods, the flours and cereal grains, breads and rolls, pastas, fancy breads, potatoes, sweetened beverages really is quite far down the list. But improvements overall in most of those categories as we've talked about. Now, I thought lastly, you'd be thinking, well, has this had any effect? So as I said, back in late 1999, in fact, when I was talking with the CEO of Diabetes Australia, he said to me, Alan, what can we do to reverse the trends in diabetes? So luckily, our Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which is a department of our federal government, has done an analysis after a little bit of lobbying, and they've looked at age standardised incidence rates for type 2 diabetes. And between the year 2000 and 2021, there's been an overall drop of 43%, which is really something to crow about, I think. And they said in the text, and these are just direct quotes, the fall in incidence may be due to improved preventative measures such as screening, increased awareness and educational programs leading to behavioural changes and risk factor modification. So, yep, thank you, Jenny. So in summary and in conclusion, Australia and New Zealand since the late 1990s, GI values and general level health claims about GI have been permitted on the labels of healthier foods. Printed and online resources have complemented the labelling claims and helped Australians and New Zealanders to understand and use the GI for everyday food and drink choices. National nutrition surveys indicate that the quality of carbohydrates consumed has improved and the GI and GL of the Australian diet has been decreasing. Diabetes incident rates are decreasing in Australia. We're not sure what's happening in New Zealand because we don't have the data. GI labelling is encouraging food reformulation and healthier choices, benefiting people with diabetes and those at risk. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions in question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think we're going to have David's talk now.
I don't have to do anything.
Would you like to sit down?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to give a short introduction to diet, glycemic index and non-communicable disease. Just a short summary as I see it. Conflicts of interest, no major conflicts of interest. My wife has worked with Tom Oliver in his GI labs, looking at the glycemic index classification of foods for industry for many years. My main conflicts are now my two daughters, Wendy and Amy, who have just published a vegetarian book, a diet book, portfolio diet for cardiovascular risk reduction, that promotes the use of low glycemic index foods. I think the primary nutritional focus over the last half century for cardiovascular disease and diabetes has been calorie reduction, weight reduction, with emphasis on healthy fats and protein sources. And this is perhaps the first really big study, big randomized control trial, testing the effect of weight loss, healthy diet and exercise in the Look Ahead trial. And very disappointingly, although the results at 1 year were excellent for body weight, for exercise, reduction in weight circumference, and reduction in hemoglobin A1C, unfortunately, these were not sustained. And that's the really important thing, the ability to sustain a diet over a period of time. And so, not surprisingly, when one looked at the CVD reduction in diabetes, the initial assessment of over 5,000 participants over 10 years, one sees that irrespective of whether we see the endpoints on the lower scale or in the expanded scale, one can see no difference between the test and control treatment in this situation. Very disappointing. 3 years later, the Look Ahead trial published another paper, Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. Here they looked at 10-year reduction in body weight over the first year, and that gave pooling test and control data. Those who lost 10% body weight in the first year showed a 21% reduction in the primary outcome of CVD. So I think there was hope, but not clear. And I think the power of weight loss is going to be supported, obviously, by Mike Lean with the diabetes remission in his trials. So I think weight loss, big issue, but maintenance of diet, very important. So how do we overcome loss of adherence? I think the Predimed example is a unique example, uniquely palatable, good diet, basically a Mediterranean diet with either extra virgin olive oil or nuts versus a controlled diet. And here one can see very nicely the cumulative incidence of cardiovascular disease reduced very nicely over a 5-year period. So sustained reduction with nuts and with extra virgin olive oil, and some effect on CVD mortality, certainly with extra virgin olive oil, not clearly seen with the nuts in this situation. But nevertheless, there's a very important study in showing if one gives unfortunately expensive foods free to participants and their families, in that case, you can get good maintenance of effect. So if plant-based fats are healthy, what about carbohydrates? I mean, what about pasta, beans, oats, barley, and other things, low glycemic index foods? And what about their effects on diabetes and CVD? So can we look at the low glycemic index carbohydrate foods, and do they too have benefits? I think Laura Sheveloli worked on this very nicely with 26 randomized controlled trials in diabetes, and was able to show that if one looked at the benefit on this side of the unity line versus the harms on this side, for glycemic control, for hemoglobin A1C, glucose, insulin, blood lipids, LDL, body weight, a raft of risk factor reductions in these randomized controlled trials with a median follow-up of 3 months. So this itself is encouraging, certainly for changes in the type of carbohydrate and glycemic index. We looked at a longer-term trial, not 3 months, 3 years, with looking at a low glycemic index diet versus a high-fiber, high whole grain diet. This is the low glycemic index diet. Again, the first year showing this nice effect, and then by the end, one sees the effects dwindling and not being significantly different, and the hemoglobin A1Cs coming up and being really at the end of the 3rd year very little different from baseline. So that was a disappointment. We did see EGFR tended to go down on the what we call the control diet, the high fiber whole grain diet, and tended to be above the unity line. So there may be some benefit for low GI foods in terms of renal function, but again, not clear. So we wanted to find out, can we stop progression of plaque? So the good effects we saw in the first year, were they perhaps reflected over the 3-year period? Might we see some differences? So this is what we'd hope to be able to prevent year 0, 2 years, 3 years. The Mickey Mouse, as it were, open mouth is the increased intraplaque, the vascular accumulation in the intermediate wall is the mouth, which opens as we accumulate more lipid in the arterial wall. These are not the ears. This is the internal jugular. This is the internal carotid, and that's the common carotid, the face. Can we see some effect of the low glycemic index diet in preventing, if you like, the mouth from opening? So the change in common carotid wall volume assessed by MRI over a 3-year period on the low glycemic index and whole wheat fiber diets. The answer is perhaps, and I say perhaps because we did see a lack of progression on the low glycemic index diet over the 3-year period and change in terms of vessel wall volume, but there was a significant increase in vessel wall volume on the whole wheat fiber diet. So unfortunately, these were not significantly different. So we can't say there was a significant difference in this situation. We would have needed 800 participants, not 160, to be studied in over the 3-year period. That would, I think, be more than we would be able to cope with, I think. So unfortunately, we just have the perhaps, if you like, there, nothing definitive. So RCTs may be useful to look at risk factor changes, but we believe large prospective cohort studies are important in nutrition to assess GI and disease associations. And I think we're very lucky here because Walter Willett, here with Jorge Samaran, through the nurses health study 1, have produced very nice data showing that with the GL glycemic load, low, medium, and high, and this is glycemic load, low, medium, and high, and cereal fiber, high, medium, and low. Your worst effect is if you have a high load and a low cereal fiber, and your best reference effect is when you have a low glycemic load and high cereal fiber. So very nicely shown here in the women, graded responses in both directions. So very satisfying, and the result of a large cohort study. I want to emphasize the large cohort study. Again, this time with Simon Liu and Walter, looking at the effect, very important, of BMI and glycemic load. So BMI, high, medium, and low, and tertiles of glycemic load 1, 2, and 3. And one can see that if you're slim, you don't have to worry about the glycemic load or the glycemic index. It's as you get fatter, then you see the graded response. So I think this is a very nice piece of data that has been produced and has been reflected in subsequent studies very nicely too. We then assessed, looking at 10 large cohorts, looked at the effects of GI on a range of disease outcomes. And for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, diabetes-related cancer, total mortality, one sees that if one increases the glycemic index, then one increases the risk of chronic disease. So, but it's large cohorts, not small cohorts. These are all large cohorts. And unfortunately, the numbers of cohorts from which the data were obtained in these particular number of studies is not 10. In fact, we have no issues, no situations where 10 was the total number of cohorts studied. So we still have a lot of work to do, sometimes only one cohort. So I think that this is an area that the large cohorts is an area that needs funding and it needs further work because the data are so valuable. And finally, can drugs do the same thing? And you know, as if a drug that slows carbohydrate absorption, does it have the same benefits? Well, the drug acarbose, the alpha-glycoside glucosidase inhibitor, alpha-glucosidase inhibitor, in the ACE study, the acarbose cardiovascular evaluation trial, the ACE study, which Rory Hellman and colleagues put together, very nice study, looked at the effect in a large number of individuals and showed that what one saw, certainly for acarbose, there was a reduction in terms of diabetes incidence. Cardiovascular effects, cardiovascular mortality, unfortunately, was not considered to be significant, although I would question whether when you've got 93% of your participants on statins, 98% on antiplatelet therapy, and 66% or more on one or more, or three or more, very heavily medicated participants, I think it's going to be very difficult adding another drug and seeing a significant difference. And I would have thought that this small parting of the ways at 3 years is still of some interest. So our conclusion is that low glycemic index diets are associated with lower incidence of diabetes, CVD, and possibly cancer in cohort studies. Hence the value of cohort studies. In dietary trials, adherence is difficult to maintain for more than 6 months to 1 year. Therefore, the RCT data in diabetes have only shown body weight and risk factor reductions. I have to say that when we see more of the Predimed study, we may have a different view on what diet may do in preventive strategies. The assessment of the association of GI, GL, fiber, and whole grains on chronic disease outcomes may therefore more readily be based on prospective studies of large cohorts. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We'll now move on to our last it's our last talk and then we have a panel discussion. So I'd like to call up Simon Liu, thank you, who's going to talk to us about a development of a national database for GI and GL. Simon?
Yep, thank you very much. My talk is, there's a reason why they make it to the last. We have another 15 minutes or so where we can discuss. This is really an ongoing project. Though we did publish a paper about a year and a half ago. I wanted to give a little bit background and also acknowledge some of the contributions for something like this that I've been thinking about for literally 25 years or longer. We wanted to do this. And for those of you who don't know me, I did the doctoral thesis on dietary carbohydrates and cardiometabolic outcomes using the Harvard cohort under Walter Willis' supervision. I don't know whether Walter is here yet. That was in the mid-1990s. But prior to that, I actually spent 4 years as a public health physician, worked in the New York State Department of Health and then also the CDC as a EIS officers. At that time, we do a lot of surveillance. And I wanted to sort of like start by, how can I progress? See, we spend all the budgets on IT, but when it comes to IT, always seems, right here, it works.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
great, thank you. So this is a paper that was affiliated with one of the, when I was at the CDC as a EIS officers, where we develop all these national surveillance programs, like the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. This is the NHANES, obviously is a multi-stage cluster sampling with the idea to get a representative samples of the entire United States, okay, rather than some of the highly selected populations cohort studies where you can do more precise estimates and do follow-up with high compliance, whereas you don't know whether or not they truly is representing the entire population and truly capture that variations. So this is one of the studies which, again, we were actually very proud to observationally, it's based on the national sample prospectively to look at weight change observationally and document it consistently with many of those not only randomized trial findings that David mentioned earlier about those DPP trial, and at that point, the Daching trial, without any reasonable doubt that if you change body weight in the amount of roughly about 5 to 10% from baselines, you can significantly reduce the risk of diabetes. And this is causal, right? So there's no argument of that. And then you can see prospectively, and this is also show unequivocally, that was in the mid-90s. By the time we published the papers, I was up to Boston, started my doctoral studies. And our prediction was pretty accurate, it turns out. Now, this cohort at that time, when I get to Boston, that's what we wanted to do this study. Well, and we also review all the literature's prospective study at that time on diet and diabetes and diet and heart disease. And Frank was alluded to earlier, presented some of those works. We actually don't know. The data was actually, people criticize the data, but the data was actually quite consistent observationally. Majority of the prospective cohort studies then, by that time, when I was a doctoral student and reviewing all those literatures comprehensively, essentially it's consistent no findings. In other words, regardless whether you're looking at high-fat diet versus low-fat diet or high-carbohydrate diet versus low-carbohydrate diet, the majority of the studies have consistently shown there's no association whatsoever, with the exception one or two of those studies that indicated that there might be some positive association between high-fat versus a low-fat diet in relation to risk of diabetes or heart disease. Now, then one would ask why? And then now you all heard that the food is medicines, and we've been thinking about this issue for literally well over half a century now. And nutrition is life. And we also know that we are studying life is extremely complicated. And then there's so many factors in our diet. So that's how I then read some of the papers that Dr. Jenkins' group had produced and show really nicely, actually, for the first time, using a somewhat of a physiological quantifiable measure, which is blood glucose response, that can add a dimension to help measure these pretty complicated dietary parameters called dietary carbohydrate. In other words, you hear that dietary carbohydrate could be from whole grain, from potatoes, from a whole slew of things. But for the first time, once you develop it like this, take into account an extra layers of parameters, then now essentially you can create a variable that allows you to across the board and standardize it. So if you look at the mathematic formula where how we incorporate glycemic index in calculating the dietary glycemic load, you would appreciate this is actually a variable that has physiological meanings. Then we actually publish, and as well as we published those findings in a series of papers in the early 2000s in AJCN, where we literally validated this kind of concept and explained clearly. Well, before you're essentially looking at some sort of like a confounding effect, so-called substitutional effects. In other words, if you look at high fat, why would someone consume a high fat diet? Because they must simultaneously reduce their other energy contributing foods to balance their total energy, right? So you're looking at substitution effect. But now since we incorporate a glycemic index of food where you can test it in the lab. So for the first time, you are looking at a standardized, uniformly variable that can compare across different sources, be they from different sources. And that's exactly what we do. And that's exactly what we find. So this is, really, now then, at that time, we already know there's a need because those Harvard cohorts, as I mentioned, highly selective. They're the nurses, they're health professionals, and the women's health studies. There's a need to develop a national database that, from a surveillance perspective, we argue that you get this, but at the time, it's just difficult to do. I remember that Frank and I have those conversations. In fact, we can do the adjustments of energy at the food level, but just hand plow through those data are really difficult to do. right? Imagine the amount of 24-hour recall. They do it a few times on so many people's. I'm running out of time already,
No.
right? Whenever the sort of like a gesture coming from Tom, it kind of make me nervous. I think it must be something. Either I say something wrong or I just use up time. But don't worry. So even now I'm a full professor, I still get nervous whenever Tom. I must have say something. See, again, the computer is behaving badly again. But I still have 5 minutes. Can someone come up and help me? But anyway, so there's a need to build this national database, right? So then, and go back to the original idea. Then I met a very smart lady also in this conference. Oh, well, we did something that I said, well, I said that then we did try to do it. This is the study that published in 2001, along with my colleague, O. Ford. Using the enhance. I literally just basically the two of us power through, two MDs, imagine there's no nursing help or student help, power through all these frequency data and then hand assign the data. While you just have to trust our integrities. The two of us are guessing, you know, this food in that food, what the glycemic index we should assign to that, and then publish the paper in JAMA Internal Medicines, demonstrating that indeed you can actually create a dietary, now this is as opposed to food level glycemic index as well as glycemic low. So this is the study that we did. Then fast forward 22 years later, literally, this is the study that finally take advantage of the modern technology with very smart young couple, Karen Delacorte and Denise Canatore. When I met Karen about 3 years ago, then we were trying to do these studies. I already expressed to her the difficulty of pursuing this work, but it turned out that she has a secret weapon. Her husband is a physicist, and who way ahead of the game and no AI. And then at that time, the OpenAI just come out this very fancy stuff here where I can show called the text embedding ADA 002, whereas essentially is some sort of a vector embedding that convert all this, now you all know ChatGPT is so powerful. At that time, literally in 2022, it just came out. And then we apply that and literally basically convert all the data from the food composition table. In fact, not only the food composition table, but also the data base that Jenny school maintained, the food database, integrated and converted and matching it and cleaning it out, doing all these foundational works with the national representative sample of the enhance. So I'm really just going to be very fast to show you the findings, what we did. We were able to assign GI values for close to 8,000 unique foods eaten by Americans, and then achieve 99.9% of all carbohydrate intakes for close to 20 years of enhance, right? And here's the food, #1 contributor. So for the first time, we don't know this. People can second guess what that number is until this now we finally find out the top contributor to American dietary glycemic load from 1999 to 2018 was soft drink. Soda alone contributed 11% of the national GI, okay? This is the data for the first time reported. Before, people were guessing. This is formally, we come up with this data, thanks to the works of two very smart young professors at Brigham Young Universities and my doctoral student, Bo Young, at Brown University at that time. And then now this is showing you very quickly, US average, the mean dietary GI of US adult was 54.3, and the energy adjusted dietary glycemic load was 123 in 2018. In fact, we also find out that GI and GL, dietary, again, not food, DGI and DGL, adjust for energy, in fact, has been declining for the past 20 years. Women tend to consume higher DGL than men. Those people who are poor have lower SES, consume higher DGL, and then the people who are Black tend to consume higher DGI and DGL as well. And then now, this is why we think it's important to do this kind of work at a national scale. Frank was also mentioning earlier that the early 2000s, when we were able to, like, none of this work is funded by NIH. I got a career development award for physicians to do this work. But at that time, at the beginning of 2000, you all heard the Human Genome Projects. So then I spent the next 10, 15 years hang out with the geneticists, because all my grants was funded was do genetic works for chronic diseases. But that actually taught me something too. The two most fundamental principles in all biology is individual variation and interaction. That's true. All math is interaction. If you exclude interaction, you can't understand biology. Still have 2 minutes, 1 minute. That's it's really is enough. Another one is individual variation. Because of these two fundamental principles of biology, and we need to do global health in humans, okay? So as epidemiology, we want to study the determinants and distributions of human conditions, including disease in human populations. Sometimes we use often the social justice perspective or the rationale to argue that we need to help the poor. We need to do studies in the low and middle income countries. But that's not enough. In fact, you can submit the argument to our current president or the current federal governments that actually just to simply do good science, you need to do global health. You have to look at the entire distributions of human race to be able to understand that variation, that interaction. And that's the reason why I think now the technology allows us to do this. And then I will still want to go back to the beginning, the acknowledgements that now we are actually, this is an ongoing project where we're trying to develop the National Dietary Glycemic Index and Glycemic Load database in Africa, South America, Asia, Europe, and North America. And the first paper published was last year's in North America. And ongoing work now, particularly for the Mediterranean regions now, we are leading with Livius leading the charge. In China, my colleague at CDC, the Chinese CDC is leading some of this work where they have national, literally also 3 decades of national, shut up, listen. All right. So if you guys have any questions or any suggestions, more than happy to answer them. And then we have also the smartphones down here.